The church smelled of damp stone and dying flowers. Clara Ashford stood at the altar with her hands folded in front of her, perfectly still, the way she had learned to be still when everything around her was falling apart. The dress was her mother's, taken in at the waist, let out at the hem, altered in 3 desperate days by a seamstress who kept apologizing without saying why. It didn't fit. Clara didn't say a word about it. The man beside her was not unkind. That was the only thing she had told herself that morning, standing in front of the small mirror in her childhood bedroom, pressing her palms flat against the scratchy lace at her wrists. He is not unkind. As if that were enough. As if that were anything at all. Thomas Holt was the groundskeeper's son. He had strong hands and a quiet manner, and he had never once, in all the years Clara had watched him work the gardens of Ashford House, looked at her the way James had looked at her. No one had ever looked at her the way James had, but James was dead. The letter had come 6 weeks ago. 2 pages, written in a hand she would have recognized anywhere, that slightly impatient slope to the letters, the way he pressed too hard on the downstrokes. She had read it so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. I release you, Clara. What we spoke of before I left, forget it. You deserve a life that is certain. Mine is not. Find someone steady, be happy. Do not wait for me. She had not cried when she read it. She had sat very quietly at her writing desk for a long time, and then she had folded the letter and placed it inside the small rosewood box where she kept the others. The ones he had written before, the ones full of promises, and she had locked the box and put the key in her pocket and gone downstairs to tell her father she would accept Thomas Holt's proposal. Her father had looked at her with something close to relief. That had been the worst part. Now the vicar was speaking. Clara watched the candle flame on the altar. It did not flicker. Outside she could hear wind moving through the elm trees, and somewhere at the back of the church someone coughed. The pews were half empty. Her father sat in the front row with his hands on his knees. Her younger sister Margaret sat beside him, eyes red, and Clara had told her that morning firmly, quietly, "Do not cry for me in that church. I will not have it." Margaret had cried anyway. "Do you, Clara Jane Ashford, take this man?" she said. Yes. Her voice did not shake. She had made sure of that. It had begun, as most things between them did, in the library. The Ashmore estate sat 4 miles east of the Ashford property, separated by a long stretch of farmland and a river that ran fast in spring and nearly dry by August. The families had been neighbors for 3 generations. They had shared fences and disputes about those fences, shared pews at the village church, shared the same uncomfortable silences at the same county dinners for as long as anyone could remember. What they had never shared, not once in 3 generations, was a marriage. Clara's father, Sir William Ashford, had made his position clear on this subject on multiple occasions and to multiple people who had not asked. The Ashworths were too grand, too old a name, too large an estate, too many expectations attached to their bloodline. "They look at us and see tenants," he had said once, and Clara, who had been 14 at the time and sitting quietly in the corner of the room, had filed this information away without comment. She had thought about it again, years later, the first time James Wentworth looked at her. She had been 20. It was a dinner at the Pembrokes' house, one of those long autumn evenings where the candles burned low and the conversation turned slow and comfortable after the 3rd course. Clara had been seated near the end of the table beside old Mrs. Ferris, who was deaf in one ear and liked to talk about her roses. Clara had been listening politely, nodding at the right moments when she had felt someone watching her. She had looked up. James Wentworth was sitting across the table and 3 seats down. He was 24, dark-haired, with the kind of serious face that looked as though it rarely smiled. But he was smiling then, just slightly, at something she had said to Mrs. Ferris that she hadn't even realized anyone else could hear. She had looked back down at her plate, but she had known, with a certainty that surprised her, that something had just shifted. It had not been simple. Nothing between them was ever simple. He was a duke's son, the only son, which meant he would be duke himself one day, which meant that every woman in 3 counties had been pointed in his direction at some point or another, and which also meant that his mother had very clear ideas about who would eventually stand beside him at an altar. Clara Ashford, clever, quiet, the eldest daughter of a baronet with more land than money, was not in any version of that plan. They had been careful, remarkably careful, for 2 people who were not careful people by nature. The library at Ashmore was where it was easiest. Clara visited with her sister sometimes, borrowing volumes that their own modest collection didn't hold, and James was often there in the mornings, at the desk by the window that looked out over the south garden. They had begun talking the way people talk when they think no one is paying attention, honestly, without performance. About books at first, then about everything else. He had told her things he suspected he told very few people. About the weight of the estate, the tenants he felt responsible for, the war that was bleeding England slowly and that he knew, eventually, would ask something of him. She had told him things she had told no one about the loneliness of being the steady one, the sensible one, the daughter who never caused trouble and was therefore never truly seen. "I see you," he had said once, not dramatically, just quietly, the way he said most things. "I want you to know that." She had not been able to speak for a moment. By the spring of 1813 they had an understanding between them, not a formal engagement, nothing that could be announced, nothing her father knew about, but a promise. The kind made in low voices in borrowed libraries that feel, when you are making them, more binding than anything written on paper. He had asked her to wait for him. She had said yes without hesitation. He left for the peninsula in June. His letters came regularly at first, every 3 weeks, sometimes more. They were addressed to her sister Margaret, which was the arrangement they had agreed on, since no one would question correspondence to Margaret from the estate. Clara would receive them from Margaret's hands, read them alone in her room, and write her replies in the same careful way, careful with the address, careful with anything that could be misread, but entirely without caution in everything else. She kept every letter in the rosewood box. She read them often, she counted the weeks. The letter that destroyed everything arrived on a Wednesday in late October. Clara had been in the sitting room doing nothing in particular. She remembered that detail later, the specific uselessness of what she had been doing, how ordinary the morning had been when Margaret came in with an envelope and an expression Clara could not read. "It came with the post," Margaret said. "It's his handwriting." Clara had taken it carefully, walked to the window, opened it. She read it twice, then a 3rd time. "I release you, Clara." She stood at the window for a long time after that. The garden below was going yellow and brown. A gardener, Thomas Holt, she realized distantly, was raking leaves near the far hedge, his movements steady and unhurried. She thought about all the things James had written to her before this. The promises, the patience, the way he had written "when I return," as though it were simply a matter of time, as though the outcome were already decided and they were just waiting for the calendar to catch up. Find someone steady. She folded the letter. She did not cry. Margaret was watching her from the doorway. "Ellie, don't," Clara said, quietly, without turning around. "Please don't." Margaret didn't. Her father proposed the match with Thomas Holt 3 weeks later with the tone of a man who had been waiting for the right moment and had decided this was it. Thomas was reliable. Thomas was there. Thomas would not leave for a war or change his mind or write letters that meant nothing. Clara listened to her father speak for a long time. Then she said, "All right." Her father blinked. He had clearly prepared arguments. He had not prepared for all right. "Are you certain?" he asked. Clara looked at him, at his relief, already creeping in at the corners before she had even finished answering, and something closed up quietly inside her, like a window being latched. "Yes," she said, "I'm certain." She married Thomas Holt on a cold Friday in December. She wore her mother's dress. She said yes without shaking. And she put the rosewood box, all of it, every letter, every promise, at the very bottom of her traveling trunk under everything else where she would not have to see it. She did not throw it away. She could not explain why. Not yet. Wiltshire, 1815. The cottage had 2 rooms downstairs and 2 up, a kitchen that let in the cold through a gap under the door, and a garden that Thomas kept better than he kept anything else in his life. Clara had learned this about him early, that he was a man who expressed care through maintenance. A fixed hinge, a repaired window latch, firewood stacked before she asked. He did not love her. She knew this the way she knew most things about her marriage, quietly, without drama, filed away in the part of herself she no longer examined too closely. She did not love him either. What they had instead was a kind of mutual, unspoken decency. They were polite at breakfast. They did not argue, because arguing required a kind of investment neither of them could honestly claim. Thomas worked the grounds of Ashmore Estate from dawn until the light failed. Clara managed the cottage, kept the accounts. Thomas was not a man for numbers, and occasionally walked the 2 miles into the village for things they needed, and things she simply had to get out of the house to feel like herself again. It was a small life. She had not expected it to feel quite so small. She had developed in the 2 years since her wedding a particular talent for not thinking about things, not thinking about the rosewood box, still at the bottom of the wardrobe where she had transferred it from her trunk, not thinking about the letters inside it, not thinking about a library with a south-facing window, or a voice that said "I see you" as though it were the simplest and most obvious thing in the world. She told herself on the harder mornings, managing. Margaret visited when she could. She was the only one who ever looked at Clara the way Clara didn't want to be looked at, with that careful, worried attention that said, "I know you are not all right and I don't know what to do about it." Clara always made sure the visits were cheerful. Tea, a walk, conversation about everything except the things that mattered. Margaret played along because Margaret loved her, and because Clara had asked her to, and because there was nothing, realistically, that either of them could do. The situation was the situation. Clara had made her choice, or her choice had been made for her. By this point the distinction felt academic, and there was no undoing it. She got up every morning. She managed. It was a Thursday in early March when she first heard his name again. She had gone to the main house, Ashmore, to deliver some accounts. Thomas had asked her to drop with the estate manager. She handed the papers to Mr. Crisp in the side office. She was turning to leave when she nearly collided with Mrs. Davies, the housekeeper who had been with the Wentworth family since before Clara was born. "Mrs. Holt," the woman said, and the name still landed strangely like a shoe on the wrong foot. "You look well." "Thank you, Mrs. Davies. Are you well?" "Oh, busy preparing." The housekeeper's voice dropped slightly. "His Grace is returning." Clara went very still. "The young master," Mrs. Davies continued, either not noticing or choosing not to notice. "Lord James, he's coming home from the continent, should be here within the fortnight, they say." She shook her head. 2 years of war and God knows what else. His mother's been beside herself. Clara said, "That must be a great relief for the family." Her voice was perfectly even. She was rather proud of that. "Indeed," Mrs. Davies said, "indeed it is. We thought well." She stopped, looked at Clara with something that might have been sympathy or might have been discomfort. "We thought the worst at one point, but he's alive. Wounded, they say, but alive." "I'm glad to hear it," Clara said. She left before the housekeeper could say anything else. She walked home across the fields rather than the road longer, but she needed the length of it. The ground was still hard with the tail end of winter. She walked quickly, not because she was in a hurry, but because moving helped. It always had. When things became too large to hold still with, she walked. He's alive. She had known this, somewhere she had not permitted herself to examine since the letter. She had known that "I release you" did not sound like a man dying. It sounded like a man deciding. And she had thought in her worst and most private moments that perhaps there was a version of this where he had simply changed his mind, found someone else, found something on the continent that had made his promise to her seem like a young man's foolishness. Those were the hardest moments, not the grief of thinking him dead that, at least, had a kind of finality to it. The other thing had no bottom. But he was alive. He was coming home. And she was Mrs. Thomas Holt, wife of the groundskeeper's son, living in a two-room cottage on the edge of the estate where James Wentworth was about to resume being Duke. She stopped walking for a moment in the middle of the empty field, the wind coming across the grass in long, cold sweeps. Then she kept walking. What else was there to do? Thomas noticed something was different that evening. He didn't say so, he rarely said things directly, but she caught him watching her at supper with that careful, sideways attention that meant he was paying more attention than he let on. She told him she had a headache. He nodded and didn't ask further, and she was grateful for it, because she was not sure what she would have said if he had. She lay awake that night long after Thomas's breathing had steadied into sleep. She thought about what she would do when she saw him, and she would see him, inevitably, because the estate was not large enough for two people to avoid each other indefinitely, especially when one of them was the Duke, and the other was married to his groundskeeper's son. She decided she would be polite. Correct. She would look at him the way one looks at any neighbor, any acquaintance, any person who occupies the same general county as oneself without there being any particular history between them. She would be absolutely fine. She rehearsed it until she almost believed it. James Wentworth arrived on a Tuesday morning 2 weeks later. Clara knew because she heard the horses on the drive. The cottage was close enough to the main approach that sounds carried, especially on still mornings, and she stood at the kitchen window with her hands wrapped around her tea and watched, without moving, as the carriages passed. She couldn't see him clearly. A figure stepping down, dark coat, the slight irregularity in his movement that Mrs. Davies had alluded to, wounded, they say. His mother on the front steps, reaching for him. Clara turned away from the window before he reached the door. She washed her cup. She dried it. She set it on the shelf exactly where it always went. She was managing. She saw him properly for the first time 11 days after his return at the quarterly tenant meeting in the village hall. She nearly didn't go this time. She went because not going would have been noticed, and she had no interest in being noticed. The hall was full when they arrived, farmers and their wives, tenant families, estate workers. Thomas found them seats near the side wall, nodded to the men around him, settled into the comfortable silence of a man who does not feel the need to fill every moment with words. Clara sat beside him with her hands in her lap and her back straight and looked at the front of the room. James was already there. He stood near the far wall, speaking to the estate manager, and he looked different, not in the ways she had expected. Thinner, yes, and there was something in the way he held himself that had not been there before, a kind of careful deliberateness, as though he had learned at some point to think before every movement. The wound, she supposed, or something else. Wars changed men in ways you couldn't always put a name to, but he also looked like himself. Exactly, devastatingly like himself. She looked away. She looked at the window, at the floor, at the family seated in front of her whose youngest child had fallen asleep against her mother's arm. She did not look at the front of the room again for a long time. When the meeting began and James spoke about the coming season, the drainage repairs in the North Field, the plans for the tenant cottages, she listened to his voice with her eyes on her own hands and thought about absolutely nothing. She was almost convincing herself. Then the meeting ended and people began to move, and in the shifting of bodies and the scraping of chairs, she found herself suddenly standing in a space that had, without warning, opened up between herself and him. 6 feet, perhaps 7. He saw her in the same moment she saw him see her. It lasted less than 2 seconds. His expression moved through several things very quickly, and Clara, who had spent 2 years preparing for this possibility, found that she had not, in fact, prepared for any of them. Then Thomas appeared at her elbow, solid, reliable Thomas, and said something about the carriage, and Clara turned toward her husband and said yes, of course, and walked with him out of the hall and into the gray March afternoon without looking back. Her heart was beating very fast. She was managing. She told herself this all the way home. What she did not see as she walked away, James Wentworth standing in the emptying hall, watching the door she had just walked through, not moving, for quite a long time. Ashmore Estate, spring 1815. The gardens were James Wentworth's first indication that something had changed while he was gone. Not in the grounds themselves, those were immaculate, better than immaculate, the hedgerows shaped with a precision that his father's old groundskeeper had never quite managed. The south lawn had been relaid. The kitchen garden expanded. Someone had planted a long border of lavender along the east wall that had not been there before, and it was not yet flowering, but you could see the intention in it, the careful thought about what it would look like in June, in July, when the bees came. He mentioned it to his mother the second evening at dinner. That would be Thomas Holt, she said, in the tone she used for things she considered beneath detailed discussion. The new groundskeeper. His father retired 2 winters ago. James nodded. He knew the name vaguely. A quiet young man he had seen working the grounds in previous years, reliable in the way that people who do not draw attention to themselves are often reliable. He married, his mother added, reaching for her wine. One of the Ashford girls. James did not react. He had learned in 2 years of war to not react to things. It was a skill that had kept him alive on at least 2 occasions he could specifically recall, and probably several he couldn't. Which one, he said. The eldest. His mother set down her glass. Clara. James cut his meat. He ate it. He asked his mother about the drainage repairs in the North Field, and she told him, and the conversation moved on, the way conversations do when both people in them have decided to let something pass. He did not sleep that night. He told himself in the weeks that followed that it did not signify. She had moved on. He had written to her, God help him. He had written to release her, because by October of 1813 the situation on the peninsula had deteriorated to the point where he had genuinely believed he would not come back, and the idea of Clara Ashford waiting for a dead man had been more than he could bear. He had written the letter in a field hospital outside Vittoria with a fever climbing and his hand unsteady, and he had given it to a courier, and then he had lost consciousness for 4 days and nearly died anyway. He had not died. He had come back, and Clara had done exactly what he asked. That was the thing about Clara. She had always done what she decided to do, fully and without half measures. He had loved that about her. He loved it considerably less now. He told himself this was rational. He told himself he had no claim, no right, no reasonable grounds for the particular feeling that settled in his chest when he thought about her in that cottage, in that life, with that man. He was quite good at telling himself things. He was not, it turned out, very good at believing them. The estate required his attention in ways he had not anticipated. 2 years of absence, even with a capable manager, left gaps, decisions deferred, repairs postponed, tenants with concerns that had accumulated quietly and now needed to be addressed with some urgency. He threw himself into it with the kind of focused energy that people around him mistook for recovered spirits. It was not recovered spirits. It was something to do that was not thinking. He rode the grounds every morning. This was how he encountered Thomas Holt with any regularity. The groundskeeper was always somewhere on the estate at that hour, working with the unhurried thoroughness that James had begun to understand was simply the man's nature. They exchanged the nods and brief words of employer and employee. Thomas was respectful without being obsequious. James found him, against his better judgment, rather easy to be around. This did not help. He saw Clara at the church on Sundays. She sat 3 rows from the front on the left side, beside her husband, in a gray dress, and a bonnet that she always removed as soon as the service ended in a gesture so characteristic, that slight impatience with unnecessary accessories, that the first time he saw it he had to look away. She never looked at him directly. Or rather, she looked at him exactly as much as she looked at anyone else, which was to say briefly, politely, with no particular expression before looking at something else. It was impeccably done. It was, he thought, possibly the most controlled performance he had ever witnessed, and he had witnessed his share. He did not know what his own face did during those moments. He hoped it did something similar. He rather doubted it. His mother had begun with the subtlety of a woman who had never seen the need for subtlety to mention other women. Lady Forsyth's daughter is in Bath this season, very accomplished, I understand. The Hargreaves girl has grown into quite a striking young woman. There is the matter of the succession, James. You are not getting younger. He listened to all of it with the patience he had developed over 2 years of considerably worse discomfort. He said, "Yes, mother, and I'm sure she is, and I understand." He said none of the things he was thinking, which were unfit for dinner conversation and wouldn't have helped anyone. He was 26 years old. He was the Duke of Ashmore. He was supposed to be thinking about the succession and the harvest yields and the drainage in the North Field. He was thinking about a woman in a gray dress 3 rows from the front on the left side. It was his estate manager, Mr. Crisp, who inadvertently broke something open. They were in the estate office on a Wednesday afternoon working through the spring accounts, when Crisp mentioned, in the offhand way he mentioned most things, which was part of why James valued him, that Mrs. Holt had been a considerable help with the quarterly ledgers. James looked up from the papers in front of him. Mrs. Holt. Crisp didn't look up from his own papers. She's sharp with numbers. Holt's a fine groundskeeper, but figures aren't his strength, so she sorts the household accounts and sometimes the estate ones when there's a backlog. She's been doing it since, the first winter, I think. Never charges extra, just does it. James set down his pen. She comes to the estate office, when needed, quiet about it, never any trouble. Crisp glanced up. Shall I tell her to stop if you'd prefer? No, James said, too quickly. He picked his pen back up. No. If it's useful, there's no reason to change it. Crisp nodded and returned to his papers. James looked at the column of figures in front of him and saw none of them. She was here. In this house, in this office, sitting at this desk possibly, doing the quiet and competent work that no one had asked her to do and that she had simply seen needed doing and done. Of course she had. He made a decision, around this time, that he was not proud of. He began to arrange his mornings so that he would be in the estate office on the days Crisp had indicated Mrs. Holt sometimes came. He told himself this was not what it was. He was a grown man and a duke, and he was not rearranging his schedule in order to accidentally occupy the same room as a married woman. He did it twice before he saw her. She came in on a Friday morning with a folder of papers under her arm, knocked on the open door with her knuckle in that brisk way she had, and stopped when she saw him at the desk. The pause was brief. A single breath, maybe 2. "Your Grace," she said, "I didn't realize you were using the office. I can come back." "Don't," he said. And then, because that was too much, "There's room enough. Crisp said you had the quarterly ledgers." "Yes." She moved to the side table where the estate books were kept. She set down her folder. She did not look at him. "I won't be long." He looked back at his papers. The room was very quiet. Outside somewhere a horse was being led across the gravel. A door closed in a distant part of the house. Inside the office there was only the sound of pages turning and the scratch of his pen, which he was moving across paper without writing anything coherent. "How are you finding the estate?" he said finally. "After 2 years away." She looked up, briefly. "I imagine that question was meant for you, Your Grace." "I meant to ask whether the estate had changed in ways you'd noticed. I'm not sure that's my place to say. I'm asking anyway." A pause. She turned a page in the ledger. "The lavender along the east wall was Thomas's idea. I thought you might tear it out when you returned. It wasn't sanctioned. But it suits the space." "I wasn't going to tear it out." "No," she said. "I didn't think you would." Silence again, but different, the kind with some weight in it, some history pressing against the edges. He should have left it there. "Clara, please don't," she said, quietly, without looking up. The way she said things when she meant them completely. He stopped. She finished with the ledger, closed it, gathered her folder. She was at the door before she paused just for a moment, her back to him. "I'm glad you came home," she said. "I mean that simply. I'm glad you're alive." And then she was gone. James sat at the desk for a long time after that, looking at the page of nothing he had written. Thomas Holt found him in the South Garden that afternoon. This was unusual. Thomas was not a man who sought out his employer for conversation. Their interactions were practical, purposeful, brief. So when James looked up from the bench where he had been sitting for the better part of an hour pretending to read correspondence, and saw Thomas coming across the grass with the direct, unhurried walk of a man who has decided to say something and intends to say it, he felt something tighten in his chest. Thomas stopped a respectful distance away. He held his hat in both hands. He looked at James with the steady, serious expression of a man who is not going to make this easier than it needs to be. "Your Grace," he said, "I hope I'm not out of place. Say what you came to say, Holt." Thomas nodded slowly. He looked down at his hat for a moment, then back up. "She never loved me," he said. "I want you to know that. And he stopped, pressed his lips together, started again. "I never deserved her. I knew it when I married her. I knew it before." His voice was even, not self-pitying, just stating a fact the way he stated everything. "She's a good woman, the best I've known. And she's been decent to me, kinder than I had any right to expect. But she's not," he stopped again. "She's not free," James said quietly. "No." Thomas looked at him steadily. "But I thought you should know what she is, what she was before all this." A pause. "What she's never stopped being." James said nothing. Thomas put his hat back on. "I'll get back to the east wall," he said, as though they had been discussing the lavender all along. "The border needs mulching before the warm weather comes." He walked back across the grass. James watched him go. He sat on the bench for a long time after that. The afternoon light moved across the south lawn. Somewhere in the kitchen garden, a blackbird was singing with extraordinary persistence. He thought about what Thomas Holt had just done, the courage of it, or the decency, or whatever you called it, when a man told you the truth about his own marriage, because he thought the truth mattered more than his pride. He thought about Clara in the estate office that morning. "I'm glad you're alive." He pressed his hands flat on his knees and looked at the lavender border along the east wall, not yet flowering, but you could see the intention in it. And he understood, with the slow certainty of a man who has been not understanding something for quite some time, that he was in a great deal of trouble. Ashmore Estate, summer 1815. The heat came early that year. By June the fields were dry at the edges, and the river had dropped to its summer level weeks ahead of schedule. The tenant farmers talked about it at every gathering, with the particular worried calm of people who have learned that worrying loudly doesn't change the weather. Thomas spent long hours rerouting the irrigation channels, coming home in the evenings with his boots caked and his shirt dark with sweat, eating supper in near silence before falling asleep in his chair. Clara watched him and said nothing about what Mrs. Davies had told her. She had been watching him for weeks now, more carefully than before, in the way you watch someone when you have begun to suspect that what you see on the surface is not the whole of the thing. Thomas had always been a private man. She had attributed this to temperament. She was beginning to wonder if it was something else. He had lost weight. Not dramatically, not in the way that announced itself, but in the gradual way of a man whose body is quietly spending more than it is taking in. He tired more easily. He never complained. Thomas Holt would not complain if his arm fell off, she thought, with a mix of frustration and something that was almost fondness. But she was a woman who noticed things, and she noticed. It was a Sunday evening in late June when Thomas finally spoke. They had eaten supper. The windows were open for the heat, and the garden was full of the long golden light that came in the evenings that time of year, and Thomas had not fallen asleep in his chair, which alone told her something, because he always fell asleep in his chair after Sunday supper. He was sitting very still, looking at his hands. "Clara," he said. She looked up from her mending. "There's something I need to tell you." He said it slowly, like a man choosing each word from a limited supply. "I should have told you before. I've told myself many times that it wasn't my place, that it wouldn't change anything, that telling you would only—" He stopped, shook his head. "I've run out of reasons not to say it." She set down her mending. "Thomas, the letter," he said, "the one you received, in October of 1813, the one that said—" He stopped again. His jaw tightened. "The one that released you from your understanding with Lord James." The room went very quiet. Clara's hands were still in her lap. She did not move them. She did not move anything. "What about it?" she said. Her voice came out entirely steady. She was distantly impressed by this. Thomas looked up at her then directly, the way he rarely did, with none of his usual sideways carefulness. "He didn't write it," he said. The silence that followed was the longest Clara had ever sat inside. She heard the blackbird in the garden, the distant sound of a cart on the road. Somewhere in the house the clock on the mantelpiece ticked with its usual indifference. "Say that again," she said. "Lord James didn't write the letter." Thomas's voice was even, careful, as though he had rehearsed this, had been rehearsing it for a very long time. "It was Mr. Richard Wentworth, his cousin." Clara looked at him. She knew Richard Wentworth. Everyone in the county knew Richard Wentworth, a smooth, handsome man of about 30 who appeared at every significant social gathering and said all the right things and had always made Clara, in some instinctive and unexamined way, want to stand slightly further from him than was necessary. "How do you know this?" she said. Thomas looked back at his hands. "Because I was there." He told her slowly. "In pieces, the way you dismantle something you have been carrying for a long time and are not sure will hold together if you take it apart too quickly." Richard Wentworth had approached Thomas's father, the old groundskeeper, in the autumn of 1813. Richard was at Ashmore frequently then, managing the estate in James's absence, and he had made it his business to know things. He knew about Clara and James. He had known for some time, Thomas said, because Richard Wentworth made it his business to know everything that might one day be useful. He wanted the estate, Thomas said. If Lord James died, and at that point it seemed possible, more than possible, the title and estate would go to the nearest male relation. That was Richard. A pause. But he also knew that if Lord James came back, and if there was already an understanding, a serious one, the kind that could be made formal, then his position was considerably weaker. A duke with a wife has less use for a cousin. "He came to my father," Thomas continued. "He said he needed the letter delivered as though it came with the regular post from the peninsula. He had a man who could copy a hand. Lord James had written enough letters from the front that there were samples enough to work from." Thomas stopped, swallowed. My father was not a strong man in certain ways. Richard offered things security, a guarantee of the groundskeeper's position regardless of what happened with the estate. My father had been worried that year about his position. "And you," Clara said quietly, "what did he offer you?" Thomas was silent for a moment. "Me," he said. She looked at him. "Your hand," he said. "He told my father that if the letter worked, if you accepted it and moved on, then he would arrange the match. That your father would agree to it." His voice was flat, not defensive, simply factual in the way of a man who has given up defending himself on this particular subject. "I was 22. I thought," he stopped. "I don't know what I thought. I told myself it would work out, that we could make something of it." A long pause. "I knew by the wedding that I'd been a fool, and worse than a fool." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the seamstress who had kept apologizing, about the half-empty church, about her father's relief, that expression she had filed away and never examined too closely because examining it would have required her to ask questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. "Did my father know?" she said. "No." Thomas shook his head. "No. Richard handled that separately. Your father was told only that Lord James had ended the understanding. The letter was shown to him. He had no reason to doubt it. But you knew," she said, "from the beginning. You knew the letter was false." "Yes, you married me knowing." "Yes." The word sat between them. Clara stood up. She walked to the window. The garden was still golden, still beautiful, entirely indifferent. The blackbird had moved to the far hedge and was singing to no one in particular. She pressed one hand flat against the window frame and looked out. She thought about 2 years, about gray dresses and quiet breakfasts and ledgers and the particular art of managing, about a library with a south-facing window, about a man who had come back from the war with something missing from his eyes and the careful, deliberate way he moved as though he had learned to think before every step. "I'm glad you came home." She had said that. She had meant it simply. She understood now that nothing about any of it had been simple. She did not cry. She had known in some private and unvisited part of herself that this was still true, that she still had this, the not crying, the standing upright, the keeping of her face. And she was grateful for it in the way you are grateful for the thing that holds when everything else gives. But something moved through her in that moment, standing at the window with her hand on the frame that she had no word for. It was not grief exactly, though it contained grief. It was not rage, though it contained that too, a quiet, white-hot fury at Richard Wentworth, at his calculations, at the sheer audacity of a man who had looked at her life, and decided it was something he could move around like furniture. It was something more total than either of those things. It was the full understanding of what had been taken. 2 years. The rosewood box at the bottom of the wardrobe. Every Sunday morning 3 rose from the front on the left side, not looking at him, teaching herself the discipline of not looking. Every morning she had woken up in this cottage and pressed her palms flat and told herself she was managing. She had been managing a lie. She turned from the window. Thomas was watching her with the expression of a man who has put down something very heavy and does not yet know if he did the right thing. "Why now?" she said. "Why tell me now?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I'm not well," he said. "Simply, I've known for some months. The doctor in Marlborough says," he stopped, started again, "it's my lungs. It's been coming on for a while." He looked at his hands again. "I don't know how long," he couldn't say precisely. "But long enough that I needed to," he exhaled slowly. "I couldn't leave you not knowing. Whatever else I've done, I couldn't do that." Clara looked at him. She thought about what it cost him to say this. Not the confession that had cost him something too, she could see it, but this. The admission of illness, of limitation, of the future contracting. Thomas Holt, who expressed care through maintenance and fixed things before they were asked and never once complained about anything. "Thomas," she said. He looked up. She crossed the room and sat back down across from him, and she looked at him steadily, the way she looked at things she intended to deal with honestly. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me." He nodded once. His jaw moved. "I'm sorry," he said, "for all of it. I know that it doesn't fix it," she said, "but I hear it." They sat in the quiet for a while after that. The light moved slowly across the floor. The blackbird finished its song. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and let herself, for the first time in 2 years, think about all the things she had not been thinking about. Not with any plan, not with any sense of what came next, just the thinking of them, the full weight of them finally allowed. The rosewood box was in the wardrobe 6 feet away. She did not get up to open it, not yet. But she knew, with the clarity that comes only at certain hours of the night, that something had changed tonight that could not be unchanged. The letter was false. The ground she had been standing on for 2 years was not ground at all. And Richard Wentworth, who had looked at her life and moved it like furniture, had not yet been asked to account for any of it. She thought about that for a long time. She was not a woman who shouted. She was not a woman who made scenes or fell apart in public or required others to manage her feelings. She never had been. But she was rediscovering, not a woman who let things go. "Find someone steady," the letter had said. She almost laughed there in the dark. She had been steady enough for all of them. Ashmore Estate, late summer 1815. She did not act immediately. This was deliberate. Clara had learned, over the course of a life that had required a great deal of quiet endurance, that the worst decisions were made in the first hours of knowing something, when the feeling was still too large and too hot and too present. She had seen other women act in those hours, had watched them write letters they regretted, say things in drawing rooms that could not be unsaid, make choices that closed doors permanently and solved nothing. She was not going to do that. She gave herself 1 week. She went about her days with the same unhurried competence she always had. She managed the cottage. She walked to the village. She sat beside Thomas at Sunday service and looked at the order of worship and sang the hymns she knew by heart. She did the estate ledgers when Crisp asked her to, sitting at the side table in the estate office with her folder and her pen, And if James was sometimes in the room, she gave no indication that this was anything other than entirely ordinary. She was, to all outward appearances, perfectly fine. Inside, she was taking inventory. The first thing she needed was evidence. Not the letter itself. The letter was gone, delivered to her father 2 years ago and long since disposed of. What she had were the originals. James's real letters, the ones written before October of 1813, kept in the rosewood box at the bottom of her wardrobe. She had not opened the box since her wedding day. She opened it now, alone in the cottage on a Tuesday morning while Thomas was on the grounds, and she sat on the edge of the bed and went through them one by one. 14 letters, some short, some long, all of them in that slightly impatient hand she would have recognized anywhere. She read them in order. She had not read them in 2 years, and she had forgotten, or perhaps she had made herself forget, how entirely himself he was in them. Not formal, not guarded. Just James, thinking on paper, the way he had talked to her in the library. She read them without allowing herself to feel most of what they made her feel, because she needed to be thinking clearly, and feeling clearly at the same time was not something she could currently manage. She was looking for one specific thing. She found it in the 11th letter, written in August of 1813. James had described in that letter a particular habit he had developed for his correspondence from the front. Because letters were sometimes lost or intercepted, he had begun marking each envelope in a specific way, a small notation in the lower left corner, a combination of the date and a number that corresponded to the letter's place in a sequence. It was the kind of practical detail that was entirely characteristic of him, and she had noted it at the time without attaching any particular significance to it. She went back through the envelopes now. All 14 letters were marked this way. August, September, October, the sequence was consistent, the notation in the same position on every envelope, the same compressed handwriting. She remembered the envelope the false letter had come in. She had kept it. She was not sure why, habit perhaps, or some instinct she hadn't examined, but she had kept it with the others in the rosewood box, tucked inside the last letter's envelope. She found it now. She held it beside James's August letter. The notation was there. Whoever had forged the letter had been thorough enough to include it, but it was in the wrong position, a 1/4 inch too high, too far from the corner. And the number was wrong. The sequence jumped from 11 to 14, skipping 2 letters entirely. It was a small thing, the kind of thing you would never notice unless you knew to look for it, unless you had 14 other envelopes to compare it to, unless you were a woman who had read those letters so many times that you knew them in her hands as well as in her memory. Clara set the envelopes down on the bed in a row. She looked at them for a long time. Then she put everything back in the rosewood box, closed the lid, and put it on the shelf where she could see it. She was done keeping it at the bottom of things. The second thing she needed was Richard Wentworth. This was more complicated. Richard was at Ashmore irregularly. He kept rooms in London and appeared in the county when it suited him, which was less frequently now that James had returned, and there was no estate to manage on his behalf. Clara had seen him twice since James's return, at Sunday service, standing at the back of the church with the relaxed confidence of a man who has never had cause to doubt his own position. She had watched him those 2 Sundays with new eyes. He was good at it, she thought. The ease, the charm, the way he laughed at the right moments and said the right things and looked at people with an attention that felt like interest but was something else entirely, assessment. She understood now. Everything with Richard was assessment. Everything was a question about what this person could offer and what it would cost to obtain it. He had assessed her once and decided she was a piece to be moved. She intended to correct that impression. Her opportunity came on a Thursday in late August. Richard arrived at Ashmore mid-morning. She saw the carriage from the cottage window, and by afternoon he was in the garden, walking the south lawn with the proprietorial air he had apparently not yet adjusted, speaking to no one in particular and looking at the estate with the expression of a man reviewing something he considers at least partially his. Clara put on her good bonnet. She walked to the estate. She found him near the east wall, examining the lavender border with an expression of mild disdain, as though it were the sort of thing one tolerated rather than appreciated. "Mr. Wentworth," she said. He turned. The assessment happened in an instant, quick practice, taking in her dress and her bonnet and her expression and filing it all somewhere before his face settled into its habitual pleasantness. "Mrs. Holt." He smiled. "What a surprise. You look very well." "Thank you," she said. "I wonder if I might have a brief word." Something shifted in his eyes, too quick to name. "Of course," he said. "Shall we? Here is fine," Clara said. She had chosen the east wall deliberately, private enough for a conversation that could not be overheard, visible enough from the house that nothing about their meeting could be mischaracterized. Richard clasped his hands behind his back. He was still smiling. "What can I do for you, Mrs. Holt?" Clara looked at him steadily. "You can start," she said, by dropping the smile. "It isn't necessary and it wastes both our time." The smile didn't disappear entirely. It never did with men like Richard, but it changed. Became something cooler and more watchful. "I have James's letters," she said. "All 14 of them from the peninsula. I also have the envelope from October of 1813, the letter that told me to find someone steady." She watched his face. "I've compared the envelopes," she continued. "The sequence notation in the lower left corner. James marked every envelope with a date and sequence number. The October letter is marked incorrectly. The position is wrong and the number doesn't follow. Whoever copied his hand didn't know about the notation system." She paused. "But James would have, which means James didn't write it." Richard said nothing. He was very still in the way of a man calculating rapidly. Now Clara said, "I don't know precisely how you arranged it or who you used to copy the hand or how much you told Thomas's father versus how much he assumed. I expect you were careful. You are always careful." She tilted her head slightly, "but I know enough. And more importantly, James doesn't know any of it yet." "Yet," Richard said. "Yet." A silence. The lavender moved in the slight breeze along the wall. From somewhere in the house came the sound of a door, footsteps, the ordinary sounds of an estate going about its day. "What is it you want?" Richard said. His voice was still even, but the pleasantness was entirely gone now, and what was underneath it was less attractive. "I don't want anything from you," Clara said. "I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here to tell you that I know, so that you understand what's coming." She picked up the rosewood box. She had been carrying it under her arm, and he had not, she noted, asked about it and held it in both hands. "I'm going to speak to James. Today. I'm going to show him the envelopes and tell him what Thomas told me. What happens after that is between you and him." She paused. "I thought you deserved to know it was coming. That's more consideration than you gave me." Richard looked at the box, then at her face. For just a moment, a single, unguarded moment, something moved across his expression that she had not expected. Not fear exactly, something more like recognition. The look of a man who has known, somewhere underneath all his calculation, that this day was a possibility and has arrived at it and found it exactly as bad as he feared. Then it was gone. "You have no proof," he said. "An envelope with a misplaced notation. A groundskeeper's son who married above himself and is now looking for someone to blame." "Perhaps," Clara said, "but I have James." She looked at him steadily. "And you don't anymore." She turned and walked toward the house. She did not look back. Her hands, she noticed, were entirely steady. She found James in the estate office. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway, and she watched the usual sequence move across his face. The careful composure he always arranged when he saw her, the effort of it visible to her now in a way it hadn't been before, or perhaps she simply allowed herself to see it now. "Clara," he said. He stood. "Is everything I need to show you something?" she said. "Please sit down." He sat. She crossed to the desk and set the rosewood box on it. She had not planned a speech. She was not a woman for speeches. She opened the box and took out the envelopes and laid them in a row on the desk in front of him, 13 of his, and the 14th, the false one, at the end. "Look at the lower left corner," she said, "of each one." He looked. She watched him understand. It did not take long. James was not a man who needed things explained twice, and he knew his own system better than anyone. She watched him get to the 14th envelope. She watched his face. He did not speak for a long time. Clara stood on the other side of the desk with her hands clasped in front of her and let him have the silence. She had waited 2 years. She could wait a few more minutes. When he finally looked up, his face was doing several things she had no name for, or rather, she had too many names for them and none of them were adequate. "Richard," he said. Not a question. "Thomas told me," she said, "last month. He's been carrying it since before the wedding." She paused. "He's not well, James. He told me because he didn't want to leave me not knowing." James stood up slowly. He walked to the window. He stood there with his back to her, one hand on the frame, and she recognized the gesture, recognized it with a start, because it was the same one she had made at the cottage window the night Thomas told her, and she had not known until this moment that they had that in common, that particular way of needing something solid to hold onto when the ground moved. "I wrote to release you," he said. His voice was low. I believed I was going to die. "I couldn't bear the thought of you waiting for, I know," she said, and he stopped. His hand tightened on the frame. "Yes, 2 years, yes." He turned around. He looked at her across the office, across the desk and the 14 envelopes and the 2 years and everything in them, and she looked back at him and she did not arrange her face into anything. She was done arranging her face. "Clara," he said. Don't apologize," she said quietly. "Not yet. There's nothing to apologize for yet. You didn't know. I should have. You were in a field hospital with a fever," she said. "You were trying not to die. You don't get to apologize for that." He looked at her. Something in his expression broke open, just slightly, around the edges. "What do we do?" he said. And it was such a different question from any she had expected. Not "what do I do," but "we" already, without discussion, as though the 2 years had not changed that particular fact, that she had to look away for a moment. She looked at the envelopes on the desk. First she said, "You speak to Richard." "Yes." And then she said, "We wait." He understood what she meant. Thomas, the illness, the thing that had no timeline and no certainty, and that neither of them could hurry or arrange or fix. "I can wait," James said. "I know you can," she said. "You've done it before, so have you?" "Yes," she said, "but I'd rather not do it alone this time." The room was very quiet. Outside, the summer afternoon continued its indifference, horses on gravel, wind in the elms, the estate going about its business. Inside the office there were 2 people standing on opposite sides of a desk covered in old envelopes, and neither of them moved, and neither of them needed to. Not yet. But the waiting this time was entirely different. Richard Wentworth left Ashmore the following morning. He did not say goodbye to anyone. His rooms were cleared, his carriage ordered before dawn. By the time the household was properly awake, he was already on the London road. James did not speak publicly about what had passed between them. He didn't need to. Ashmore Estate, autumn 1815, winter 1816. Thomas Holt died on a Wednesday in November. It was a quiet death which suited him. He had been a quiet man. The illness had moved slowly at first and then, in the final weeks, with a swiftness that left little time for anything except the practical matters he had always preferred anyway. The accounts settled, the tools returned to their proper places in the groundskeeper's shed, the garden notes written out in his careful hand, and left on the kitchen table for whoever would come after him. He had asked Clara in his last coherent days to keep the lavender border. She had promised him she would. He died in the small bedroom of the cottage, in the gray early light before sunrise, with Clara sitting beside him and his hand in hers. She had been there all night. She did not let go until she was sure. Then she sat for a long time in the quiet of the room and thought about Thomas Holt, not the marriage, not the letter, not any of the complicated architecture of what had been done and why. Just the man himself. his steady hands, his unhurried way of moving through the world, the garden he had made out of nothing, and the way he had looked at it, and the rose he had planted along the south fence in the first spring that bloomed every June without fail. He had not been a good husband in the ways that mattered most, but he had, in the end, been a good man. She thought that deserved to be held separately from everything else. The county was respectful in the way that counties are respectful when a young man dies briefly, sincerely, and then with the efficient resumption of normal life that is perhaps the most honest response to grief there is. The funeral was small. Thomas's father, fragile now and diminished, sat in the front pew and did not look at Clara. She did not require him to. James came to the funeral. He stood at the back of the church, in the same dark coat he had worn the day he returned from the continent, and he did not approach her or speak to her or do anything except be present, which was, she thought, exactly right. She did not look at him during the service, but she knew he was there. It helped, more than she would have known how to say. The weeks after the funeral had a particular texture that Clara recognized from other hard periods, that strange suspended quality of days that look ordinary from the outside and feel, from the inside, like walking through water. She managed the cottage. She finished the autumn accounts for the estate. She walked to the village and back and exchanged pleasantries with people who looked at her with careful sympathy, and said things like "you're bearing up so well" in tones that suggested they found this faintly suspicious. She was bearing up. She was also, underneath the bearing up, doing something she had not done in a very long time. She was allowing herself to want something, not yet acting on it, not yet doing anything about it, just permitting the wanting, the way you open a window you have kept shut for a long time and let the air move through. It was uncomfortable. It was also, unexpectedly, something like relief. James did not come to the cottage. She had half expected him to, or perhaps half feared it, the distinction being somewhat academic, but he stayed away with the same deliberate restraint she recognized from the office, from the church, from every encounter they had managed over the past months. He was, she thought, giving her the thing she had given him at the desk with the envelopes: time, space, the room to find her own footing before anything else was asked of her. It was, she thought, the most James thing he could possibly have done. She was not sure whether to be grateful or frustrated. She settled on both. Winter arrived early. The fields went gray and the river rose with the November rains, and the cottage, without Thomas's constant maintenance, began to show its age in small ways: a shutter that needed rehinging, a gap in the kitchen door that let in the cold in a new and specific way. Clara fixed what she could fix and left the rest on a list. She had been in the cottage alone for 6 weeks when the first frost came. She woke that morning to a silence that had a different quality than the usual silence, the particular hush of a world that has gone white overnight, and she lay in bed for a moment and looked at the ceiling and thought, clearly and without drama, that she was very tired of waiting. Not for James specifically, for her own life. For the version of it that she had been standing just outside of for 2 years, pressing her palms flat and managing and telling herself it was enough. It was not enough. It had never been enough. She got up, she dressed. She made tea and drank it standing at the kitchen window, looking at the frost on the garden, at the bare rose along the south fence, at the lavender border she had promised Thomas she would keep. Then she put on her coat and her good boots and walked out the door. She was not going to James. She told herself this very firmly for approximately the first quarter mile. She was going for a walk. It was a fine morning, cold and clear, and she needed air, and the fact that her walk was taking her in the direction of the main house was simply a function of geography and had nothing whatsoever to do with anything else. She was not, she told herself, a woman who walked toward things she wanted before she had properly decided to want them. She stopped walking. She stood in the middle of the frost-white path between the cottage and the main house, in the early morning quiet, with her breath making small clouds in the cold air. She thought about Clara Ashford, who had stood at an altar in a dress that didn't fit and said yes without shaking and filed away her father's relief and put the rosewood box at the bottom of everything and managed for 2 solid years. She thought about what that woman deserved. She started walking again. She arrived at the main house as the household was waking smoke from the kitchen chimney, a groom crossing the yard, the sounds of morning settling over the old stones. She went to the front door, which she had never in her life used. She was the groundskeeper's wife, or had been, and the groundskeeper's wife used the side entrance, and she knocked. The housekeeper answered. Mrs. Davies in her morning cap looked at Clara with an expression that moved quickly through surprise and arrived at something that might have been, underneath its careful neutrality, approval. "Is he in?" Clara said. "In the library, ma'am," Mrs. Davies said. "The south-facing one. Of course he was." Clara almost smiled. "Thank you," she said, and walked inside. She heard him before she saw him, the sound of a chair, papers moving, the specific quiet of a man at a desk who has been there since early and intends to stay. The library door was half open. She pushed it the rest of the way. He was at the desk by the south window. Dark coat, dark hair, the winter light coming in flat and clear behind him. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway, and she watched his face go through its usual sequence and then stop. Something different this time. Something that did not settle into composure because he did not, apparently, have the composure available. He stood up. He said nothing. She said nothing. She stood in the doorway of the library where it had started, all those years ago, in the careful and deliberate conversations of 2 people who were trying very hard not to say the obvious thing, and she looked at him across the room. "I'm not managing," she said. He blinked. "I've been telling myself I am," she continued. "For 2 years I've been very good at it. But I woke up this morning and I was very tired of it, and I thought," she stopped. "I thought I should come and say that, before I talked myself out of it." James came around the desk. He crossed the room in the particular careful way he moved now, that deliberateness she had noticed when he first returned, the leg, the learned patience of a body that had been broken and put back together, and he stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to look up slightly to meet his eyes. He looked at her for a long moment. "Are you done?" he said, "talking yourself out of things?" "I think so," she said. "Yes." "Good," he said. "Because I have been standing outside your door in my mind every morning for 6 weeks, and the actual door has been considerably more difficult." She felt something loosen in her chest, something that had been wound tight for so long she had forgotten what it felt like without it. "You could have knocked," she said. "You needed time. I've had enough time." "I know," he said. "I was waiting for you to know it too." She looked at him. "Did you ever stop?" he said, quietly. The question she had known was coming, or something like it. She thought about the rosewood box at the bottom of the wardrobe, about the Sunday mornings 3 rows from the front, about lying in the dark looking at the ceiling and finally letting herself think about all of it. "No," she said. He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, not with any of the urgency she might have expected. Just took it the way you take hold of something you have been careful about for a long time and have finally decided to simply hold. She let him. Outside, the frost was beginning to melt in the winter sun, dripping from the eaves in a slow and steady rhythm. Somewhere in the house a clock chimed the hour. The south-facing window filled the library with pale, clean light. Neither of them moved. Neither of them needed to. Not yet. But the waiting was over. 5 years later. The rose bloomed every June. Alina had not moved it. She had considered it in the first spring after she came to the main house. There had been a great deal to consider that spring, a great deal to arrange and decide and settle, new rooms to learn and old habits to quietly set aside, an entire life to reorient around a different axis. The question of a single rose along the south fence of the cottage garden had seemed, in the context of everything else, minor. Something to return to later. But she had walked past it one morning in May before the bloom, when it was still just canes and new leaves and the promise of something, and she had stopped. She had stood at the fence for a while with her hands in her coat pockets and looked at it. She had thought about Thomas's hands, the steadiness of them, the care. And about the morning he had told her everything, and the evening light in the cottage that last June he was well enough to tend the garden himself. She had left the rose where it was. No one had commented on this. Mrs. Davies, who noticed everything, said nothing. The new groundskeeper, a young man from the village, had been told simply that the south fence planting was to remain as it was, and he had nodded and asked no further questions, because a duchess who says a thing is to remain as it is does not generally require elaboration. James had not asked about it until the third year. They had been walking the grounds on a June evening, the kind that lasts long and goes golden at the edges and makes the whole estate look like something from a painting, which Alina found slightly excessive but had learned to appreciate, and she had paused at the fence in the way she always paused there briefly, without ceremony, and he had paused beside her in the way he always paused beside her when she stopped, without asking why. After a moment he had said simply, "You kept it." "Yes," she had said. "Why?" She had thought about it honestly, the way she thought about most things. Because he was a good man, she said, and good men deserve to be remembered, whatever else they were or weren't. James had looked at the rose for a long moment. The evening light caught the blooms deep red, fuller than she had expected when she first saw them, the kind of rose that commits entirely to being itself. Then he had taken her hand, the way he had taken it in the library on the frost-white morning, without drama and without urgency, and they had walked on. He had never asked about it again. But sometimes, on June mornings, she caught him looking at it from the upper window of the east bedroom, standing there with his coffee going cold, and his expression one she had come to know well. Not jealousy. Jealousy had never been his nature, and even if it had been, she thought he understood too clearly what Thomas had done at the end to feel anything except a kind of complicated gratitude. What she saw in his face on those mornings was something more like respect. The quiet acknowledgement of a man who had made his own errors, who had written a letter in a field hospital and believed it was the right thing and lived with what followed, and who therefore understood, better than most, that people are not reducible to their worst moments or their most impossible circumstances. Thomas Holt had been a man who made a bad choice young and spent years paying for it in the particular silent currency of a man who knows himself to be in the wrong and cannot find the door out. And then, when the door finally appeared, he had walked through it. He had told the truth. He had let her go. That deserved to be remembered. Alina loved James for understanding this without being asked. She loved him for many things. That was simply one of them. The county had adjusted, as counties do, with a combination of genuine warmth, performative propriety, and the irrepressible human appetite for narrative that makes other people's lives so much more interesting than the participants generally find them. There had been talk in the months following Thomas's death. Alina had expected this and had prepared for it with the method she applied to most unwelcome things. She ignored it entirely and continued about her days with an equanimity so complete that it left very little for the talk to feed on, and talk, deprived of response, tends to eventually find more cooperative subjects. James had been less serene about it, which she had found privately endearing. He had the restraint not to say anything publicly, but she had seen his jaw do a particular thing at certain dinner parties when certain people said certain things, and she had learned to place her hand on his arm at those moments lightly, which generally helped. They had married in April of 1817. A proper wedding, a dress that fit, made by a seamstress who took her time and apologized for nothing, in a fabric that Alina had chosen herself in a London shop on a bright February morning with Margaret beside her saying that one, definitely that one before Alina had even finished looking. The church was full. The morning smelled of spring and candle wax, and the lilies someone had arranged along the aisle in great extravagant quantities that Alina would not have chosen herself and that were, she admitted, entirely beautiful. Her father had sat in the front row. His expression when she came down the aisle was one she had not seen on his face before, or perhaps had not allowed herself to look for. Something open, something that cost him something to show. She had decided, somewhere between the door and the altar, to let him have the moment without auditing it. Some accounting could wait. Some could be set aside entirely. Margaret had cried from the first hymn. Eleanor had told her beforehand with great firmness, "Do not cry in that church, I mean it this time." Margaret had looked at her with the expression she had worn since childhood when she intended to do something regardless of what anyone said. They had both known exactly how it would go. It had gone exactly that way. Eleanor had not minded. Richard Wentworth had not attended the wedding. He had not, in fact, been seen in the county at all since the morning he left Ashmore before dawn. He was in London still, as far as Eleanor understood. She did not think about him often. In the beginning she had, in those weeks between Thomas's death and the frost-white morning, lying awake in the cottage with the wind in the elms and too much silence, she had thought about Richard with a clarity and a coldness that surprised her. Not the operatic fury she might have expected, something quieter and more precise. The specific anger of a woman who has done everything correctly and been cheated anyway, who has managed and endured and asked for nothing and been taken advantage of for exactly those qualities. She had spent that anger slowly, over the following months, in the way that useful things are spent not wasted, but used up in the process of becoming something else. What remained was not forgiveness. She was an honest woman, and she did not believe in calling things by names that didn't fit. It was something more like resolution. A ledger brought to zero, not because the debt had been repaid, but because she had decided, deliberately and with full awareness, that she was no longer willing to carry it. Some things could not be undone. They could only be survived. She had survived them. They were hers now not as wounds but as history. The unalterable record of a woman who had been knocked entirely off the life she was meant to have and had built another one painstakingly out of whatever was to hand, and had arrived somewhere she had not expected and found it, against all reasonable prediction, entirely worth having. She had paid a considerable price for the woman she had become. She had decided that woman was worth the price. On a morning in late June, 5 years after the frost-white walk and the library and the hand taken without drama, Eleanor stood in the garden of Ashmore and watched her husband come across the south lawn toward her. He moved differently now than he had in that first year. The leg had improved with time and consistent attention, and the particular stubbornness of a man who refuses to be managed by his own body. And what remained of the injury had settled into something more natural. A slight asymmetry in his stride that she had long since ceased to notice, except in the abstract way you notice things that have simply become part of the landscape of a person you know very well. He was 31. The war was 15 years ago now in calendar terms and considerably further in every other sense, though she knew it was not entirely gone. She had learned where it lived in him, the specific silences, the occasional mornings when he woke before dawn and sat in the library not reading, and she had learned that the most useful thing she could do on those mornings was make tea and sit beside him and not require him to explain anything. He had never asked her to do this. She had simply understood it, the way she understood most things about him now, not through instruction, but through the long, patient accumulation of attention. He reached her and stopped beside her and looked at what she was looking at, which was the east wall, the lavender, in full bloom, the purple of it extraordinary in the morning sun, the bees already at work with the cheerful single-mindedness of creatures who have never doubted their purpose. It was exactly as Thomas had imagined it would be when he planted it in the cold of that first spring. She thought he would have been pleased. "I've been thinking," Eleanor said. "Should I be concerned?" James said. "Possibly." She looked at the lavender. "I think we should extend it, along the north wall as well." He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was genuinely considering something rather than preparing a response. She had learned to tell the difference. "That's a considerable amount of lavender," he said. "Yes. The bees will be insufferable. The bees," she said, "will be magnificent. The gardener will have opinions. The gardener, she said, will manage. He looked at her then. She could feel it before she turned, that particular quality of attention that she had first noticed across a dinner table more years ago than she entirely liked to calculate. The look that had not changed in all the time since. The one that saw her specifically and entirely and without any of the adjustments or reductions that most people, even well-meaning ones, applied without knowing they were doing it. "All right," he said. "North wall as well." She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her. She reached out and took his hand, the way he had taken hers, without drama and without urgency. The simple and complete gesture of two people who have stopped needing to make anything of it, because it is simply what they do. And they stood in the June morning with the lavender moving in the slight breeze and the bees conducting their magnificent, insufferable business, and the rose blooming quietly along the south fence of the cottage, just visible from where they stood. It was a very ordinary morning. It was, Alina thought, exactly what an extraordinary life looks like from the inside, not dramatic, not arranged, not anything like the life she had once imagined she would have. Just this. The garden and the light and the hand in hers and the particular pleasure of a decision made together about something as simple and as permanent as where to plant lavender. She had waited a long time for ordinary mornings. She intended to have a great many more. Clara Ashford arrived at an altar in a dress that didn't fit. She had altered it herself in 3 days from her mother's old gown, because there was no time for anything else, and she was not the kind of woman who complained about what couldn't be changed. She stood at that altar and said yes without shaking and filed away her father's relief, and walked out of the church into a life she had not chosen, and she made of it what she could, which was more than most people would have managed and considerably less than she deserved. She did not collapse. She did not rage publicly. She did not write desperate letters or make scenes at dinner parties or require anyone to manage her grief. She woke up every morning and pressed her palms flat and told herself she was managing, and she was managing in the way that very strong and very private people manage, which is to say, completely and at considerable cost, and without anyone fully seeing what it required. That cost is what this story is about. Not the romance, though the romance is there. Not the villain, though Richard Wentworth earns every moment of his quiet ruin. Not even the ending, though the ending is earned in ways that most endings are not. The story is about what it takes to remain yourself when everything around you is conspiring, through malice or circumstance or simple human failure, to make you into something smaller. Alina never became something smaller. She was broken, let us not pretend otherwise. The letter broke something in her that did not fully heal for a long time, and the marriage, however decent Thomas ultimately proved to be, asked things of her that she should never have been asked to give. She paid and paid and paid for a debt that was never hers. But she kept the rosewood box. That is the detail that matters. She put it at the bottom of everything, yes. She buried it under 2 years of gray dresses and quiet breakfasts and Sunday mornings spent not looking at the man 3 rows in front of her. But she did not throw it away. She could not explain why, she told herself. But we know why. She knew why. Because some things are worth keeping even when keeping them costs you something. Because the truth of who you are and who you loved and what you were promised does not stop being true simply because someone decided to arrange the world differently. Because Alina Ashford, even at her most managed and most contained, had never entirely stopped believing that the truth would eventually matter. It did, it always does for women like Alina, not quickly, not without cost, not without 2 years of a life that didn't fit and a dress altered in 3 days and a father's relief that landed like a verdict. But eventually, in a frost-white morning and a library with a south-facing window and a hand taken without drama, the truth came back around. Thomas Holt deserves a final word too. He was not a hero. He made a bad choice for comprehensible reasons and lived inside that choice for years without the courage to undo it, and the woman beside him paid the price. That is true, and it should not be softened. But he told the truth in the end when it cost him something to tell it, when he was ill and tired and had very little left to spend, and he spent it on honesty. He let her go. He left the rose. Good men are not men who never fail. Good men are men who, when the moment finally comes, do the right thing anyway. He was, in the end, a good man. Eleanor kept the rose. She was right, too. Some women are broken by what life does to them. Eleanor was clarified by it. She arrived at the end of this story knowing exactly who she was, exactly what she wanted, and exactly what she was worth. Not because the world had been kind to her, but because it hadn't been, and she had refused, in the quiet and private way of women who do not make scenes, to let that be the final word. The lavender grows along the east wall of Ashmore still, and along the north wall now, too. The bees are, as predicted, magnificent. Thank you for listening to this story all the way to the end. If it stayed with you, let us know which moment affected you most and which city you're watching from. Your comments shape the next stories more than you think. If you enjoy this kind of storytelling, don't forget to subscribe and leave a like so you won't miss what's coming next.